A millionaire CEO told his wife, "I don't want to know you." 5 years later, he wept when he saw her with their 3 daughters. Jason White had built his life around the idea that nothing mattered more than achievement. Every morning he woke up before the sun, dressed in the same perfectly tailored blue suit, and checked his calendar with the same cold focus that had made him a millionaire before he was 30. People in his company admired him, feared him, and never questioned his decisions. He liked it that way. Control was his only measure of success, and he refused to let sentimentality slow him down. Even at home, where he returned late every night, the walls were as clean and impersonal as the conference rooms where he spent his days. The only softness that remained in his life was Ada, and sometimes he thought he resented her for it more than he loved her. She would wait up for him in the living room, her dark hair loose over her shoulders, her blue eyes tired but hopeful. He almost never met that hope with anything but annoyance. One evening she stood up as soon as he came in, holding something in her hands. He could tell she was nervous. Her voice was quiet, almost apologetic when she said she had something to tell him. He didn't sit down. He didn't put down his briefcase. He just waited, already bracing himself for another conversation he didn't have time for. When she said she was pregnant, he didn't feel what she obviously expected him to feel. No surge of tenderness or anticipation, only a dull shock that someone else had made a choice without asking his permission. For a moment they looked at each other in complete silence. He saw her smile falter, saw her eyes fill with questions he knew he didn't want to answer. Before she could speak again, he shook his head. His voice was flat and cold when he said the words that would stay with them both forever. "I don't want to know you." He didn't shout, didn't even sound angry. That, he would realize much later, was the part that hurt her the most. He said it as if she were a problem he could cross off his list. She didn't cry. She just stood there holding her stomach, her lips parted as if she were trying to breathe through a pain she hadn't prepared for. He turned away, telling himself it was the right decision. He convinced himself she would be better off without him, that she was too soft for the life he intended to lead. That night, he slept in the guest room, telling himself he needed distance to think clearly. He never noticed when she finally went to bed or how she lay awake staring at the ceiling, her hand resting protectively over the tiny life he had already rejected. In the morning, she was gone. Ada left before dawn without a single word spoken between them. She didn't take much. Just one suitcase, the small amount of money she had in her own account, and the quiet, unsteady hope that somewhere far from Jason she might be able to start again. As the train carried her away from the city, she kept a hand pressed to her belly, feeling the steady flutter of the tiny heartbeat inside her. She told herself she would not cry anymore for a man who could look at her and speak those words as if she were nothing. But when she closed her eyes, she still saw the way he had turned his back without hesitation. She rented a small apartment in a quieter town 2 hours away. The building was old and smelled faintly of damp concrete, but the landlord was kind and didn't ask questions she couldn't answer. She bought a second-hand crib from a woman down the street who had also been left alone. That woman pressed a paper bag of baby clothes into her hands and said she would pray for her. Ada thanked her and went home to unpack in silence. She tried not to look at the space beside her bed where she had imagined Jason would someday put his hand on her stomach and feel their child kick. The first months were a blur of nausea and fear. She found part-time work at a bakery, baking through the night so she could rest during the day when her body felt heavy with exhaustion. Each morning, she would touch her swelling belly and whisper that everything would be okay, even when she wasn't sure she believed it herself. She didn't call Jason. She never expected him to come looking for her. The only thing she allowed herself to hope for was that someday she would feel strong again. When the girls came into the world, the hospital staff stared. 3 identical babies, each one a perfect echo of the others, all with the same blonde hair that was not hers, and the same clear blue eyes that would always remind her of him. She held them in her arms and cried because she knew that no matter how far she had run, she would never truly be free of Jason White. But she also felt something stronger than regret. She felt the fierce certainty that they deserved more than his rejection, more than her sadness. She named them Lily, Cameron, and Bella, names she had chosen in the quiet hours when she lay awake and tried to imagine what kind of future she could give them. In the years that followed, Ada learned how to be everything on her own. She learned how to stretch a paycheck to cover rent and baby formula. She learned how to carry all three girls up the stairs when they were too tired to walk. She learned how to hold her head up in the grocery store when strangers asked where her husband was. At night, when she tucked them into bed, she would sometimes feel a hollow ache in her chest and wonder if she had made the right decision to leave without ever giving him the chance to change his mind. But then one of the girls would sigh in her sleep and reach for her hand, and Ada would close her eyes and know she had done what she had to do. She didn't need his approval. She didn't need his money. She just needed to keep loving them enough for both of their parents. And she did. 3 years passed in a rhythm of small routines that had nothing to do with Jason's world anymore. Ada rose before dawn to pack 3 lunchboxes with careful sameness, tying each little blonde ponytail with matching ribbons, brushing crumbs off tiny yellow dresses that never stayed clean for more than an hour. She walked them to preschool every morning, one child holding each hand and the third skipping just ahead, never quite in step. Sometimes Ada thought that story followed her like a shadow she could never step out of, but most days she simply didn't have time to care. She was too busy making sure her daughters felt safe and loved and never doubted for a second that they were wanted. At night, when the girls were finally asleep, she sat on the edge of the narrow sofa and closed her eyes against the hum of the old refrigerator and the weariness that crept into her bones. She rarely let herself think about Jason anymore. What was the point? He was probably sitting in some high-rise office overlooking the city skyline, convinced he had been right to send her away. Maybe he had convinced himself she had never been important, that the children were better off without him. In her darker moments, she almost wished she could hate him enough to forget him completely. But then, she would hear a sleepy voice calling Mama, and the sharp edge of that bitterness would soften into something sadder and heavier. She never told the girls about their father beyond the simplest truth. He had chosen not to be there. She refused to teach them to hate a man they had never met. Occasionally, a glossy magazine would appear in the rack at the grocery store with Jason's face on the cover. She always looked away quickly, afraid that if she studied the picture too long, she would start imagining how different everything might have been. The headlines always praised him, the brilliant CEO who built an empire before 40, the man who never let personal distractions derail his vision. She wondered if she and the girls were the distractions those articles hinted at. She wondered if he ever regretted the price of his success. But she knew that wondering didn't change anything, so she tucked those thoughts into the quietest corner of her mind and refused to feed them. The girls were growing into themselves, each with her own secret world. Lily loved stories and would sit cross-legged for hours, paging through picture books, her brow furrowed in concentration. Cameron was the first to climb anything and the first to laugh when she fell. Bella was the one who always noticed when Ada was tired and climbed into her lap without a word, resting her head on her shoulder. Sometimes she told herself again and again that it was better to have that emptiness than to invite in the kind of coldness Jason had shown her. And yet some nights, when the lights were out and the apartment was quiet, she would close her eyes and admit to herself that she still missed the man she thought he could have been. But in the daylight, there was no time for regret. There was only breakfast to make, scraped knees to kiss, small hands to hold as they crossed the street. Ada chose to believe that all the tiny moments of care would be enough to fill the space Jason had left behind. She didn't expect to ever see him again. She certainly didn't expect that when she did, everything she thought she had accepted would come undone in a single heartbeat. It was an ordinary Saturday afternoon when the shape of Ada's life shifted without warning. She had promised the girls a small treat after their doctor's appointment, so they stopped at the shopping center on the edge of town. The girls were giddy with anticipation, their little yellow dresses bright against the polished tile floor, as they pressed their hands to the glass case of the bakery, debating which cupcakes to choose. Ada stood just behind them, clutching her worn leather purse and smiling faintly at their chatter. She almost didn't notice the man stepping out of the elevator across the wide atrium. She almost didn't look up at all. But some instinct she couldn't name made her lift her head, and for a moment she thought her mind was playing a cruel trick. Jason stood there as if he had simply stepped out of her memory and into the present. He looked almost exactly as she remembered, tall and composed, his blonde hair neatly combed, his blue eyes scanning the space with that familiar detached focus. The only thing that had changed was the faint strain in his expression, the tightness at the corners of his mouth that hadn't been there before. He was wearing a crisp blue suit, and he looked so polished, so impossibly out of place in this small-town shopping center that Ada felt the breath leave her lungs in a rush. For several seconds, neither of them moved. Her heart thudded painfully against her ribs as she realized he was staring straight at her. It was too late to pretend she hadn't seen him, too late to turn away before recognition dawned in his eyes. His gaze dropped to the three little girls, lined up neatly in front of the display case, and she saw the exact moment he understood. His face went pale. His mouth opened as if to speak, but nothing came out. Ada's first instinct was to gather her daughters and leave. She had practiced this moment in her mind so many times. She had always imagined that if he ever appeared, she would be able to walk away without hesitation. But now that he was here, flesh and blood and visibly shaken, she found herself unable to move at all. Her hands tightened around her purse strap. She felt a hot flush of anger rising under her skin, followed by something more dangerous. The ache of all the years she had spent wishing he would care enough to look for them. The girl sensed her stillness and turned to see what she was watching. Three pairs of blue eyes identical to Jason's lifted to meet his across the polished floor. Lily was the first to speak, her voice clear and curious. "Mama, who is that man?" Jason flinched at the word, as if it struck some place he wasn't prepared to feel. For an instant, Ada hated him for daring to look wounded, for letting that single syllable shake him when he had walked away without a backward glance. She swallowed hard, feeling her composure slip. She straightened her shoulders and laid a hand lightly on Lily's head, her voice steady even though her heart was beating so fast she thought she might faint. "He's someone—" She could see the question in them, the silent plea for her to confirm what he already knew. She didn't speak, but she didn't look away. She felt he finally found his voice, rough and unsteady. "Ada," he said, and her name sounded foreign on his tongue, like something precious he had never learned how to hold. "Are they—" She didn't want to give him the gift of that answer, but the girls were watching, waiting to see what she would say. So she nodded once, a tiny gesture that seemed to steal the strength from his legs. He reached for the back of the nearest bench as if he needed it to stay standing. No one spoke. The girls shifted restlessly, not understanding why the air had grown so heavy. Ada thought she had prepared herself for every possibility, but she had never imagined she would see tears in Jason's eyes. When they finally spilled over, she felt something break loose inside her, something she hadn't realized she was still holding on to. She didn't know whether to turn away or reach for him. So she did neither. She just stood there, her hand resting protectively on the head of the nearest child, while the man who had once sworn he didn't want to know her struggled to swallow the weight of what he had left behind. For a moment, it felt like the entire shopping center had gone silent around them. Though Ada could still hear the low murmur of people placing orders at the bakery counter and the faint music playing overhead, she watched Jason wipe his eyes with the back of his hand in a gesture that was almost boyish in its uncertainty. She had never seen him look so stripped of certainty, so undone by anything. Part of her, she knew deep down, that this confrontation had been waiting for both of them since the day he closed the door on their life. He took a shaky breath and stepped closer, stopping just a few feet from her. His voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. "I didn't know," he said. "Ada, I swear to you, I didn't know." She felt her jaw tighten as the words settled between them. It was not an apology, not really. It was an explanation, an excuse dressed up as regret. Still, when she looked at his face, so pale and disbelieving, she felt something in her chest twist in a way she wished it wouldn't. "You didn't want to know," she said softly, and even now the memory of that night felt as vivid as if it had happened. "Yesterday. Oh, you told me not to exist." He looked down, his hands flexing helplessly at his sides. "I was wrong," he whispered. "God, I was so wrong. The girls shifted beside her, their curious eyes moving from her face to his. Bella reached for her hand and tugged gently. Mama, is he mad? Ada swallowed, forcing herself to smooth her daughter's hair. No, she said, though her voice shook. He's just surprised. Jason lifted his gaze to her again, and for the first time she saw no arrogance in it, no certainty that he was right, only devastation. Can I? His voice cracked and he pressed his lips together before trying again. Can I talk to you alone? Every instinct in her body told her to refuse. She didn't owe him an audience, not after all these years. But she also knew that there were things she would have to say eventually, words she had rehearsed in the dark when the girls were asleep. She looked at the children who were watching them both with wide, unblinking eyes. Girls, she said gently, would you like to pick out a treat? I'll be right here. They nodded and turned back to the glass display case, pressing their hands to the glass again. She waited until she was sure they were distracted before she faced Jason fully. Say what you came to say, she told him. He took another step forward, and for a moment she thought he might reach for her hand. But he stopped himself, dropping his arms back to his sides. I thought I was protecting my life, he said. I thought if I let you in, if I let any of it in, I'd lose everything I'd worked for. You did, she said, and her voice was quiet but steady. You lost us. He flinched as though she had struck him. I see that now, he said, his throat working as he swallowed. I see it every day. I don't expect you to forgive me, Ada. I don't even expect you to let me close. But I have to try. I can't just pretend they don't exist. That you don't. She didn't know how to answer that. Part of her wanted to scream that he had forfeited every right to this moment the day he turned away. But another part of her, smaller, sadder, older, recognized that the girls deserved the truth about where they came from. They deserved more than silence and bitterness. I'm not going to make this easy for you, she said at last. You don't get to walk in here and be a father because it suits you. They don't know you. They don't owe you anything. His shoulders sagged. I know, he said again, and she almost believed he did. I'm not asking you to pretend. I'm just asking you to let me be here, to let me try. Her throat felt tight as she looked at him standing there with tears still drying on his face. She wished she could hate him enough to refuse outright, but she had spent too long raising 3 little girls who carried his eyes to pretend that he didn't matter. Before she could answer, Lily called out, her voice bright and oblivious. Mama, can we have cupcakes? Ada turned away from Jason, forcing herself to smile at her daughter. Yes, she said, her voice gentler than she felt. Pick whichever ones you like. She didn't look at Jason again as she helped the girls choose their treats. But as she paid the cashier, she felt his presence behind her, patient and tentative. And she knew this was only the beginning of something they would all have to face. But when she turned to see that he was still standing there, waiting even after she paid for the cupcakes and gathered the girls around her, she felt an unfamiliar jolt of uncertainty. He wasn't walking away. He wasn't trying to reclaim something as if the past hadn't happened. He simply looked lost in a way she didn't know how to reconcile with the man she remembered. She took a steadying breath and shifted the paper bag of pastries in her arms. The girls circled her legs, glancing up at Jason with wide eyes that mirrored his own. I'm walking them home, she said, her voice flat because she didn't trust herself to let any softness in. If you want, but he nodded, swallowing hard, and fell into step beside her as she led the girls out of the shopping center into the bright afternoon. The street was busy with weekend shoppers and children carrying balloons, the air smelling of hot pavement and roasted coffee from the cafe on the corner. The girls chattered over each other about the cupcakes, who would get which one, whether they would save some for tomorrow. Ada clung to the ordinariness of their voices because it was the only thing keeping her steady. Beside her, I don't know how to begin, he said, his voice low, almost afraid. I thought about this moment so many times, and nothing I practiced in my head feels like enough. Ada kept her gaze on the sidewalk. Nothing you say will be enough, she said without malice. That doesn't mean you shouldn't say it anyway. He nodded slowly, his hands flexing at his sides. When I saw them, I knew. I knew I'd made the biggest mistake of my life. I thought pushing you away would protect me from becoming someone I didn't know how to be. She stopped walking then because she couldn't pretend she wasn't listening. The girls ran a little ahead, chasing a scrap of paper that fluttered along the curb. She turned to face him fully. "Someone you didn't know how to be," she repeated softly. "A father." He flinched at the word, and she realized he had never said it aloud himself. He lifted his gaze to hers, and she saw the shame there, deeper than any pride he had once clung to. "Yes," he whispered. "I was afraid. And I thought if I let myself care, I'd fail at it. So I pretended it didn't matter. That you didn't matter." For a moment, she couldn't speak. She was back in that kitchen, her hand on her belly, hearing him say, "I don't want to know you." She felt again how small she had become in that instant. But she also felt something else, a tired, reluctant relief that he was finally saying it. "You were wrong," she said, her voice steady in a way she hadn't expected. "About all of it." He nodded once. "I know." His gaze flicked to the girls as they circled back toward them, giggling over their found scrap of paper. "I can't ask you to forgive me," he said. "I'm not here to demand anything. I just want—" She felt the ache of everything they had lost, but for the first time she also felt a fragile thread of something else, something almost like hope. She turned back to him and said the only thing she could manage. And then, together, without another word, they walked the rest of the way down the narrow street. When they reached her building, the girls dashed up the steps, arguing over who would hold the door. Ada paused before following them inside. She looked back at Jason and met his eyes, seeing for the first time that he looked just as scared as she was. "One day doesn't fix anything," she said quietly. "I know," he said, his voice breaking. But I have to start somewhere." She nodded, then turned and went into the building without looking back. And though nothing had been decided, though nothing was healed, she felt something shift inside her. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was the start of something she had thought was gone forever, a beginning. Jason came back the next morning because he didn't know what else to do. He had spent the night in a hotel room that felt too big and too sterile, staring at the ceiling and trying to reconcile the image of Ada, standing there with their daughters beside her, with the version of his life he had always insisted was complete. He hadn't slept more than a few hours, and when dawn came, he found himself standing on the sidewalk outside her building, hands buried in his coat pockets, wondering if she would even open the door. When she did, she looked wary, but not surprised, as though part of her had known he wouldn't be able to stay away. The girls crowded behind her, still in their pajamas, their hair sticking up in soft, golden tangles. They peered around her legs at him, wide-eyed and solemn, and something in his chest clenched so hard he almost had to look away. Ada didn't invite him in at first. She stood in the doorway, one hand braced against the frame, as if she needed to hold herself steady. He couldn't blame her. He had been the one to strip away any foundation they might have built together, and it would have been easier for her to slam the door and pretend she had never seen him again. He would have deserved it. But instead, she took a long breath, and after a moment she stepped back just enough to let him cross the threshold. He moved slowly, careful not to make assumptions about where he belonged. The apartment was small, warm with the smells of coffee and the faint sweetness of syrup. There were 3 little backpacks, lined up neatly by the door, each with a name stitched in bright thread. He read them one by one, Lily, Cameron, Bella, and felt another crack open in the shell he'd spent years building around his heart. The girls watched him with silent fascination as he took off his coat and knelt so he was closer to their height. He didn't reach for them. He wasn't sure he had the right. He simply looked at each of them in turn, memorizing every detail he had missed. Lily was the first to speak, her voice soft but certain. "Are you coming back tomorrow too?" she asked, as though this was the most natural question in the world. Jason swallowed hard and nodded. "If your mom says it's okay," he managed. Ada didn't answer right away. She moved past them to the kitchen, her shoulders tense, and he knew she was listening to every word. He followed slowly, stopping in the doorway as she filled 3 cups with juice. She didn't look up, but her voice was calm when she finally spoke. "They don't know how to feel about you yet," she said, "and I don't either." "I don't expect you to," he said quietly. "I'm not here because I want to feel better about myself. I'm here because they're my daughters, and because I can't pretend they aren't anymore." For a long moment, she just stood there, her hand resting on the counter. Then she turned to face him, her eyes tired but clear. "If you mean that, you'll have to show them. Not just today, not just when it's convenient." "I know," he said. "I'm ready." "Are you?" she asked, her gaze searching his face for any sign of the man who had walked away. He didn't look away. "Yes," he whispered, because it was the only truth he had left. She studied him a moment longer, then nodded once, a tiny motion that felt like a door unlocking. She called to the girls, and they came running, jostling for places at the small table. He helped them. When breakfast was over, Lily slipped her hand into his without hesitation, and Cameron climbed into his lap with a shy smile. Bella hovered near Ada's knee, studying him with cautious eyes. He knew Ada didn't say much as she cleared the table, but when she passed him with an empty plate, she paused just long enough to meet his gaze. "You can come back tomorrow," she said, her voice very quiet. He nodded, unable to find any words that felt big enough. Later, when he left, he turned on the sidewalk and saw all three girls pressed against the window watching him go. For the first time in years, he felt something close to peace. Because even if nothing else was certain, he knew he would be back. Jason returned every morning for the next week. He came before the girls were dressed and stayed until their bedtime stories were finished. He didn't come with expensive gifts or grand gestures, because he knew that nothing he bought could fill the years he'd missed. Instead, he learned the smallest details of their days. He learned each morning he sat cross-legged on the floor and let them hand him dolls and crayons and scraps of construction paper until the edges of his immaculate suit were smudged with glue and fingerprints. He did not care. She never told the girls he shouldn't be there. But she didn't soften either, not at first. She was polite, quiet, her voice steady even when her eyes looked exhausted. Sometimes she would ask about his work in the careful tone of a woman trying to keep her distance. Other times she said nothing at all. He never pushed. He knew he was only beginning to prove he could be different. One evening, after the girls had insisted he read 3 books in a row, he set down the last one and looked around the living room. The walls were covered in their drawings and photos of birthdays he hadn't been there to see. He thought of all the nights she must have sat in this same chair, rocking a feverish child or soothing nightmares with no one to turn to. The guilt pressed so hard into his chest, he almost couldn't breathe. Ada walked past him on her way to the kitchen, and he couldn't stop himself from speaking. "You were right to leave," he said, his voice rough. She paused but didn't turn around. He swallowed hard, staring down at his hands. "You did." When she finally turned to look at him, her eyes were shining. "I didn't want to do it alone," she said quietly. "I just didn't have a choice." He felt something fracture in his chest. He stood and walked to where she stood by the counter. He didn't try to touch her. He only met her gaze and let her see all the regret he carried. "I'm here now," he said. Not because Finally she nodded, as if she had come to some private conclusion. "Then be here," she said, "and don't make them pay for your doubt again." "I won't," he said without hesitation. When he left that night, the girls were already asleep. He paused at their door, studying the 3 small shapes curled under matching blankets. In the dim, but he also knew he would never stop trying to become the kind of father they deserved. On the landing, Ada came to stand beside him. For the first time, she didn't keep her distance. She rested her hand lightly on the doorframe. "You can..." She nodded once, and though she didn't smile, something in her expression had finally shifted. He understood that trust wouldn't come all at once, that forgiveness might never come fully. But he also understood that this was the first moment they had both stood on the same side of the past. And that was enough to keep him going. As he stepped into the night air, he felt the smallest thread of hope winding through all the regret and longing, something fragile but undeniable. He would be back at dawn and the day after and the day after that, for as long as it took to show all of them that he was never going to disappear again. I think it's honest about how much harm Jason caused by abandoning Ada and the girls, and it never tries to make his regret into something heroic. What makes the ending meaningful is that he doesn't expect forgiveness as a reward for returning. He knows he has to earn trust with small, consistent actions over time. I appreciate that Ada doesn't rush to forgive him. Her guarded acceptance feels real. She allows him near, but sets clear boundaries to protect her children and herself. It ends with an understanding. Rebuilding trust is slow and sometimes painful, but it can begin if you have the humility to admit you were wrong. In the end, this isn't about a man redeeming himself with one grand gesture. It's about a man who finally chooses to stay, to be present, and to take responsibility. That's a quieter kind of redemption, and one that feels much more true.
A millionaire CEO thought he had it all, until three 6-year-old girls in pink dresses walked into his office with resumes, and called him Daddy. New York buzzed beneath a silver morning sky, the kind that stretched endlessly above steel and glass. Inside one of Manhattan's most elite skyscrapers, the top floor pulsed with the quiet intensity of high-stakes business. The office of Brightcore's CEO was a minimalist masterpiece: sleek marble floors, cold metallic lines, and a massive wall of glass looking out over the city like the throne room of a modern king. At the center of it sat Andrew Blake, a man used to commanding silence without ever raising his voice. Andrew was the kind of figure who never looked rushed, even when markets were crashing. In his light-colored designer suit and polished Italian shoes, he appeared carved out of calm itself. His dark hair was trimmed with surgical precision, and his icy blue eyes scanned the screen in front of him, already 10 steps ahead of everyone else. At 38, he had what most men only dreamed of: power, wealth, control. He had no children, no family, no mess. Or so he thought. That illusion shattered at precisely 9:03 a.m. His secretary's voice came through the intercom, uncertain in a way that immediately caught his attention. "Mr. Blake, there are 3 little girls here. They say they have an appointment with you." He frowned, leaning forward. "Children? What department sent them up?" There was a pause, then, "They didn't come with anyone. They're alone. And they insist you're expecting them." Before he could respond, the door swung open, and in came the strangest sight his office had ever seen. 3 girls, maybe 5 or 6 years old, marched in with purpose. Each wore a light pink dress, ruffled and slightly wrinkled as if they'd been sitting on the subway too long. They had matching yellow backpacks with tiny glitter stars and white sneakers that squeaked on the marble floor. All 3 had thick, dark hair falling in uneven waves past their shoulders and eyes that gleamed the same impossible blue as his own. They walked straight toward his desk, lined up like little soldiers, and placed what looked like hand-drawn resumes in front of him. "Hello, Mr. Blake," the one in the center said with a serious tone. "We came to apply for a job." Andrew blinked, completely thrown off. The girl to the left added helpfully, "We're good at drawing. And singing. And counting to 100. "We brought our resumes," said the third, lifting her yellow backpack and pulling out a sheet of paper filled with hearts and stick figures. Before Andrew could speak, the middle girl added something that stopped his breath cold. "Our mommy is in the hospital. She said you're our daddy." Silence, dense and unmovable, fell across the room. Andrew looked from one girl to the next. They were triplets. Identical. And staring at him like they'd practiced this moment over and over. The one with freckles pointed to the drawings. "She told us if we get to you, you'll know what to do. She said this is your office. That you're the boss of everything here." He stood slowly, unable to ignore the way his pulse had spiked. "Your mother's name. What is it?" "Sophie," they said together. "Sophie Carter." The name hit him like a crash behind the eyes. Sophie. He hadn't heard it in years. Not since the two of them were tangled in something passionate, fragile, and doomed from the start. She had disappeared from his life one day without a word, no note, no goodbye. He searched for her, called, emailed, even hired someone to look. Nothing. She had simply vanished. Now, out of nowhere, 3 little girls who looked exactly like him were standing in his office, asking for a job and claiming to be his daughters. One of them reached up, slipping her tiny hand into his. Her fingers were warm and shaking slightly. Please, she said softly. Mommy said if we didn't find you soon, they'd take us away. Andrew Blake, master of negotiations and ruthless boardroom battles, found himself lost for words for the first time in years. There were no spreadsheets, no charts, no quarterly reports that could prepare him for this. He looked down at the girls, at their identical faces, at their trembling chins, at their matching hope, and knew that everything he thought he understood about his life had just been rewritten. The meeting he had scheduled for 9:15 would have to wait. The office remained silent long after the girls had sat down on the plush leather sofa across from Andrew's desk. He hadn't said much, hadn't moved much either. The only thing he had done was cancel his entire day's schedule with one quiet instruction to his assistant: clear everything. I need time. He didn't offer the girls juice or snacks, didn't pretend to smile or ask them questions about school or hobbies. He simply stared, at their faces, their hands, the way one of them picked at the hem of her dress nervously, while another swung her legs over the edge of the couch, too short to reach the floor. Their resemblance to Sophie was there, faint and soft, the shape of their lips, a particular tilt of the head, but their eyes were unmistakable. They were his. That thought repeated in his mind like a drumbeat, relentless and impossible to quiet. He remembered Sophie so vividly now it ached. She had been wildfire wrapped in silk, quick to laugh, impossible to pin down, and completely different from anyone he had ever met. They had spent one blazing summer together, tangled up in late-night rooftop talks, impulsive road trips, and quiet mornings in his old apartment when she made pancakes and danced barefoot to jazz. It hadn't lasted long, but it had burned brightly, and then, without warning, she disappeared. One morning she just didn't come back. No call, no letter. Her phone number stopped working. He had gone to her apartment only to find it empty, stripped of anything personal. She had vanished like she never existed. He had tried to find her, he had the money and the means, but she had covered her tracks well. Eventually, he had stopped trying, but not because he stopped caring. He stopped because it began to feel like chasing a ghost. And now, after all this time, 3 living, breathing pieces of her sat in front of him. "Where's your mother now?" he asked finally, his voice lower than usual, careful not to startle them. It was the girl in the middle who spoke again. She seemed to be the leader, or at least the most composed. "She's in the hospital," she said, her small hands folded tightly in her lap. "She got very sick a few months ago. First, she had trouble breathing. Then she got tired all the time. She said it's something called stage 4. Andrew felt the words hit his chest like a stone. He didn't need a medical degree to know what that meant. Another girl added, "She said it's not going away. The medicine isn't working anymore." "We were living with a neighbor," the third one said softly, "but then Miss Claire said she couldn't take care of us. Mommy told us where to find you. She said you'd be scared when you saw us, but that you're good. She said you'd take care of us if anything happened." Andrew rubbed a hand across his face, unable to process the speed at which the ground beneath his feet had shifted. The facts were clear and terrifying. Sophie had been pregnant when she left. Not with one child, 3. She had given birth, raised them alone for 6 years, hidden them from him for reasons he didn't yet understand, and now was dying. Dying, and trusting him, a man who hadn't even known they existed, to protect them. It felt like stepping onto a stage mid-performance and realizing the entire audience had been watching your life without your knowledge. He rose and walked to the bar cart near the window, not for alcohol, but simply to do something with his hands. He poured a glass of water, stared at the skyline, and then turned back toward the girls. "I need to see her," he said. They nodded, all 3 at once, as if it had already been decided. "She's at Memorial," said the one with the braid. "Room 513. Do you know if she wants to see me?" "She said she hoped you would come," the middle one replied. "But she didn't want to make you feel trapped. That's why she didn't call. She said she wanted us to meet you first. So you'd know we're real." He sat down heavily in the armchair across from them, and for a moment, there was only the distant hum of traffic through the windows and the quiet shuffling of little shoes. She also said, the youngest girl whispered, that she forgave you. The words hit him like ice. He had been the one abandoned. The one left without answers. But now, in the presence of these small girls who didn't ask for any of this, his sense of betrayal began to shift into something else entirely, guilt, maybe. Or responsibility. Or a deep, unexpected ache that felt a lot like regret. He had no idea how to be a father. He didn't even know where to start. But somehow, looking into their eyes, he knew there was no going back. The waiting room outside the hospital's oncology wing smelled faintly of antiseptic and stale coffee. Andrew sat there, his usually immaculate suit wrinkled at the cuffs, his fingers tangled together in a rare display of nervous energy. It had been 2 days since the girls had walked into his life and shattered everything he thought he knew. Now, he was here, not as a CEO or a public figure, but as a man who might be about to meet the woman who had once left without a word, and perhaps the only woman who had ever truly mattered to him. The drive over had been quiet. The triplets, Mia, Hazel, and Lily, sat in the back seat of his town car, unusually solemn. They didn't ask for music or snacks or cartoons. Instead, they held hands and stared out the windows as if they were preparing for something they couldn't quite name. He'd offered to come alone, but they had refused with silent, determined looks, the kind that told him these girls had already seen more than they should have. A nurse finally led them through a maze of white-walled corridors and softly beeping machines to room 513. When the door opened, the breath caught in Andrew's throat. Sophie lay propped up against a stack of pillows, her skin pale, her frame thinner than he remembered. Her hair, once thick and wild, was now tucked into a silk scarf, and though the light in her eyes had dimmed, it was still undeniably her. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The girls ran to her immediately, crawling into the narrow bed with the unself-conscious ease of children who didn't know how fragile the human body could be. She held them close, kissed the tops of their heads, then looked up and met Andrew's gaze. A faint, tired smile curved her lips. "You came." He stepped forward slowly, unsure of what words to use, unsure if any would be enough. "I did." She patted the edge of the bed, a quiet invitation. He hesitated, then sat beside her, careful not to disturb the cluster of medical tubes and wires. For a long time, they didn't speak. The girls were whispering something to each other about the hospital food and how it tasted like paper. It gave them a layer of privacy he hadn't expected. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me," Sophie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't know where you were. You disappeared, Sophie. I searched. I tried." "I know," she said gently. "And I was watching you the whole time. I just couldn't let you find me." He turned to look at her, eyebrows furrowed. "Why?" Her eyes shimmered, but not with tears. More like years of buried emotion rising to the surface. "Because I was scared. Because I was pregnant and I didn't think you'd want it. Not one baby, 3. I could barely wrap my head around it myself. And you were already building something so huge, so far from the chaos I was living in. I didn't want to be another burden, or another wound." His voice cracked slightly when he spoke. "You should have let me decide." "I know," she said again. "But by the time I felt brave enough to call, they were toddlers. And then I got sick. And then it just got worse. There was always a reason to wait." He exhaled sharply, trying to process the timeline that had unfolded without him. "So when you told them about me, was that a backup plan?" She didn't get defensive. Instead, she looked at him with something much deeper than pride or apology. "It was hope. I told them you were kind. I didn't know if it was fair. But I remembered who you were. The real you. Not the magazine covers, or the headlines. The man who once skipped a board meeting to stay in bed and read poetry with me. The man who gave cab drivers $100 tips because they looked tired. I wanted them to know that man, even if I wasn't around to see it. Andrew felt something shift inside him, guilt, yes, but also a slow, warm current of grief. He looked at the girls, now sitting quietly in a circle at the foot of the bed, drawing on the back of hospital charts with crayons a nurse had given them. They were so real, so alive, and so astonishingly his. I want to take care of them, he said finally, the words landing like a vow. Not just until, not just temporarily. I want to be their father. Properly. I'll do whatever I have to. Sophie didn't cry, though her breath hitched. She nodded, her hand reaching for his. Thank you. That's all I needed to hear. Later that day, Andrew made the arrangements. A court-approved DNA test was ordered, though even before the results came back, no one who saw them together could have doubted their connection. The girls, who had been calling him Mr. Blake out of habit, started slipping in a quiet "Dad" here and there, testing the word like a new language. And when the results did arrive, conclusive and clear, he held the paper in his hands and understood that this was the beginning of something he couldn't yet define, but already couldn't live without. Andrew had signed the paperwork without hesitation, the legal language barely registering in his mind. Custody was initially marked as temporary, an emergency placement due to their mother's condition, but he already knew there was nothing temporary about what he felt. The day he brought the girls home, the penthouse felt more like a museum than ever. The sleek glass walls, minimalist furniture, and muted gray color palette, once the epitome of modern success, now seemed cold, sterile, and vastly unprepared for 3 6-year-olds with glitter-stained fingers and endless energy. The first hour had been chaotic. Hazel knocked over a sculpture that Andrew didn't even remember owning, Lily cried because there was no pink toothpaste, and Mia attempted to climb the kitchen counter to reach the cereal on the top shelf. Andrew stood frozen in the middle of it all, completely overwhelmed by how unqualified he was to manage any of it. He had negotiated billion-dollar mergers, handled international crises, and stood before rooms of hostile investors with unwavering confidence, but now, faced with the daily logistics of parenting, he felt like a man tossed into the ocean with no idea how to swim. He'd hired help, of course. A highly recommended nanny named Serena arrived the next morning, punctual and professional, with references and a clipboard. She had been trained in early childhood development and spoke 3 languages fluently. Andrew thought she might be the solution to everything. The girls disagreed. They refused her routines, ignored her rules, and insisted on eating breakfast sitting cross-legged on the kitchen floor. By the end of the second day, Serena resigned politely, her smile strained and eyes slightly wild. Andrew tried a different approach. He brought in tutors, child psychologists, even a private chef who specialized in kid-friendly nutrition. None of it worked. Mia declared that the chef's green smoothies tasted like sadness. Hazel asked if the tutor could teach her how to make explosions instead of long division. Lily locked herself in the bathroom and cried until he sat on the floor outside the door and read every page of a princess book aloud through the wood. It became clear that they didn't want structure. They wanted him. They followed him everywhere. Into his office, into the gym, even into early morning meetings over Zoom. One afternoon, he found them sitting quietly under his desk while he delivered a presentation to an international board of directors. When he tried to shoo them out, Mia whispered, "But this is your cave. We're your little bears." That was the day he stopped closing his office door. He began to learn, slowly and clumsily, how to be theirs. He learned how to braid hair, though his fingers were all thumbs and the results were lumpy. He learned to wake up early to make pancakes in funny shapes, sometimes they looked like dinosaurs, sometimes just puddles, but the girls cheered for them anyway. He learned that Hazel needed a nightlight shaped like the moon, that Lily hated loud noises unless they came from fireworks, and that Mia liked to fall asleep listening to the sound of rain on headphones, even when it wasn't raining. They changed everything. They left crayons in his briefcase, bubble wands in his car, glitter on his expensive shirts. His pristine office began to gather fingerprints and juice boxes and scribbled drawings taped next to financial charts. For the first time in his adult life, Andrew missed meetings because of school performances, forgot conference calls because of stomach bugs, and canceled business trips because Lily asked if he'd still be her daddy even when he went away. He started to answer to "Dad." At first, it felt surreal, like he was pretending to be someone he wasn't. But over time, it stopped feeling like an act. It became something solid, something real. Something he was becoming. One night, maybe 3 weeks in, he was standing in the hallway outside their bedroom. The girls were asleep, tangled in pink sheets, clutching stuffed animals with wild hair and missing eyes. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the city outside. Andrew leaned against the wall and closed his eyes, exhaustion washing over him, but it wasn't the same kind of tired he felt after long work days. This was deeper, but also more peaceful. It felt like purpose. He didn't know exactly when the shift happened, when the sense of duty turned into something more like devotion, but he knew that if someone had asked him right then what the most important thing in his life was, the answer wouldn't have been his company, or his money, or even his name. It would have been 3 little girls in mismatched pajamas, sleeping down the hall. It happened on a Thursday morning, the kind Andrew had come to expect as part of his new life, chaotic, loud, and completely unpredictable. He had woken up to the sound of whispered giggles and the distant crash of something hitting the marble floor. By the time he entered the kitchen, barefoot and still half-dressed, all 3 girls were sitting at the island counter wearing child-sized business suits, clip-on ties, and oversized sunglasses that looked suspiciously like a pair he had misplaced weeks ago. Mia stood on a stool, pouring orange juice into 4 mugs labeled, "World's Best CEO," while Hazel and Lily shuffled through papers that were clearly printed off one of his home office computers. "What," he said, rubbing sleep from his eyes, "is this?" Hazel adjusted her sunglasses with the gravitas of a tiny executive. "We're ready for the meeting, Mr. Blake." Mia nodded. "We have ideas for the company." Before he could ask what company they were referring to, Lily slid a document across the counter toward him. It was titled, "Operation, Make Work More Fun," complete with pie charts drawn in colored pencil and several glitter stickers stuck haphazardly around the border. The first bullet point read, "More snack breaks for everyone. Snacks equals energy equals profit." The second, "Let people wear fun clothes on Fridays. Suits are boring. Maybe even costumes sometimes." The third, "Less yelling, more hugging. Hugging boosts morale." We Googled it. He stared at the paper for a long moment, then looked up at them. "Are you seriously planning to come to the office like this?" "We already packed our bags," Mia said brightly. "We have markers, snacks, and emergency unicorn band-aids." Against his better judgment and every instinct he had as a corporate leader, Andrew let them come. That afternoon, the elevator doors to Brightcore's executive floor slid open with a soft chime, and out marched the girls, still in their miniature suits, each holding a tiny clipboard and wearing expressions of complete confidence. The receptionist blinked in confusion. A senior advisor dropped his coffee. And Andrew, walking behind them with a face that dared anyone to question this, simply said, "They're shadowing me today." The reactions were immediate and varied. Some employees smiled and whispered. Others looked terrified. But no one said a word out loud, because Andrew Blake never brought guests, let alone 6-year-old girls in pink sneakers, into the war room where the board made decisions that shaped the future of the company. They sat through the first 15 minutes of the operations meeting without a word, legs swinging under the high-backed chairs, chewing on apple slices while the heads of departments reviewed analytics. Then, during a tense discussion on employee retention, Lily raised her hand. "Excuse me," she said politely, "have you considered giving out stickers when people do a good job?" Silence fell like a dropped pin. One of the managers coughed. Another shifted awkwardly in her chair. Andrew didn't say a word. He just leaned back and looked at the board, waiting. Hazel took the opportunity to jump in. "My teacher says people work harder when they feel happy." You should let everyone wear pajamas to work once a month. You'll get more smiles. Smiles mean less quitting. Mia pulled out a page from her folder and held it up like it was the closing argument of a courtroom drama. We made a graph. It's not real numbers, but it feels right. Someone, no one was quite sure who, laughed. Then another. Then the CFO chuckled so hard he nearly spilled his water. Within minutes, the tension that had weighed down the room cracked and gave way to something else entirely: joy. Lightness. Something that hadn't been felt in those walls for a long time. Andrew watched it unfold with a strange mix of pride and disbelief. These children, without even trying, had managed to accomplish something that no strategy session or leadership retreat had ever achieved. They made the company feel human again. That night, an employee posted a blurry picture on social media of the triplets sitting at the board table with the caption, "New management at Brightcore. Things are looking up." The post went viral within hours. Journalists called. Bloggers speculated. Headlines appeared: CEO's secret weapon, his 6-year-old daughters. Andrew didn't care about the buzz. What mattered was what he saw in his employees: the shift, the laughter, the shared stories over coffee the next day about the kid who asked for more hugs in the workplace. Brightcore's mood changed. Productivity didn't drop. In fact, it rose. More importantly, people smiled more in the elevators. They lingered longer in conversations. For the first time, the company didn't just look successful, it felt alive. Later that weekend, after the girls had gone to bed, Andrew sat at his desk looking at one of the graphs they'd made, colored bars labeled fun, snacks, hugs, and bored. The fun column was the highest by far. He smiled to himself, tapped a pen on the desk, and quietly wondered how he'd gone so long without understanding what really mattered. He'd built an empire, but these girls had given it a soul. The hospital visits became routine, though nothing about them ever felt normal. Every few days, Andrew would load the girls into the car, help them buckle into their seats, and drive across the city to Memorial Hospital, where Sophie remained in room 513. The girls always brought her drawings, handmade cards, and tiny gifts: a paper flower, a string bracelet, a rock they found in Central Park that looked kind of like a heart. They would climb into the hospital bed beside her, all three squeezed close, as if by pressing their bodies to hers they could hold back whatever was coming. Sophie smiled every time, even when her skin grew paler and her movements slower, even when her voice grew thin like tracing paper. Andrew never brought work with him to the hospital. He left his phone on silent, his laptop shut. In those sterile white walls, there were no deals to be made, no clients to impress, only moments to witness and protect. Sometimes he sat quietly in the corner, watching as Sophie braided Hazel's hair with shaky hands or taught Mia how to fold paper cranes. Other times, he read aloud when her throat was too sore, stories from children's books and, once, from a battered poetry collection Sophie had loved when they were younger. She listened with her eyes closed, smiling at the sound of his voice like it anchored her to the world. One rainy afternoon, after the girls had fallen asleep in a makeshift pile on the sofa beneath a hospital blanket, Sophie asked Andrew to step outside with her. She had refused a wheelchair that day, insisting on walking slowly with an 4-pole in one hand and his arm in the other. They stood together in the small courtyard behind the building, the drizzle turning her scarf darker at the edges. Her face looked translucent in the dim light, but her eyes were steady. "I need to say things while I still can," she said softly. Andrew didn't argue. He simply nodded and waited. "I never meant to keep them from you. I told myself it was protection, but the truth is, I was afraid. Afraid you'd take one look at all that chaos and turn away. But I was wrong. You were never the one who ran." He looked down, jaw tight. "I should have looked harder. I gave up." "No," she said gently, "you didn't. You were living. I was hiding. That's not your fault." She leaned against his shoulder, and he instinctively steadied her. For a long while, they just stood there, silent. Then she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "They're going to need you soon. Not as a replacement. Just, as something solid. Something that doesn't disappear." He looked at her, at the fragility of her, and felt something like grief press against his ribs, tight and sharp. "I don't know if I'm enough for them. I still don't know what I'm doing." "No one does," she said with a tired laugh. "But you love them. They know that. And they don't need perfection. They need presence. You've already given them more than I ever could have imagined." He didn't reply. He just held her hand, cold and light in his. Sophie died 3 nights later, in her sleep, with the girls curled beside her like kittens. The hospital called at dawn, and Andrew arrived before the sun fully rose. When he entered the room, it was quiet except for the rhythmic sound of the machines that no longer mattered. The nurse met his eyes and nodded, then gently left them alone. The girls didn't cry right away. It was Lily who noticed first, her small voice breaking the silence. "Mommy's not breathing." Andrew moved quickly, but not to panic. He knelt beside the bed and placed his hand gently on Sophie's chest. The absence was immediate, a silence too vast to fill. Mia looked at him with wide eyes, her voice trembling. "Is she sleeping?" He shook his head slowly. "No, baby. She's gone." Hazel crawled into his lap and buried her face in his chest. Lily clung to his side. Mia stayed near the bed, watching her mother's face like she couldn't believe it wouldn't move again. Andrew held all 3 of them for a long time. He didn't rush. He didn't pretend to have answers. He let them cry, let them ask the same questions over and over. When the sun finally rose over the city outside, its light pouring into the room like gold, Sophie looked almost at peace. The funeral was small. Sophie had left instructions, nothing formal, nothing grand. Just people who knew her, a few songs she loved, and white daisies, her favorite flowers. The girls wore simple white dresses. Andrew stood beside them, not in the front row, not above them, but next to them, his hand always close. When Mia wanted to speak, he knelt beside her at the podium and whispered encouragement into her ear until she found the words. When Hazel cried uncontrollably in the middle of the service, he lifted her into his arms and didn't put her down for the rest of the ceremony. That night, back at home, the girls were quiet. Dinner went untouched. The house felt heavier than ever. Andrew sat with them on the living room floor, surrounded by pillows and blankets, and told them stories about their mother, how she once danced in the rain in the middle of Times Square, how she had a laugh that could turn any mood around, how she used to say, "Love is not a promise, it's a practice." Lily fell asleep first, her thumb in her mouth, her head on Andrew's lap. Hazel followed not long after. But Mia stayed awake, eyes red and raw, staring at the ceiling. "Are we going to be okay?" she asked. Andrew didn't answer right away. He looked around the room, at the art they'd drawn on the walls, at the stuffed animals now gathered in corners, at the photos he'd taken of them over the past few weeks already framed and hanging above the fireplace. "Yes," he said finally, brushing her hair back from her face. "We are. It's going to hurt. But we're going to be okay. Because we're together." It wasn't a dramatic promise or a grand declaration. It was simple and quiet and real. And for the first time in days, Mia closed her eyes and let herself sleep. Spring came slowly that year, as if the city itself were trying to move gently forward in the aftermath of so much change. The air grew warmer, the parks turned green again, and in Andrew's home, once a sterile palace of steel and silence, there was now color, noise, and the constant motion of 3 growing girls finding their way through grief and childhood at the same time. It wasn't easy. There were nights when one of them would wake up crying, calling for a mother who would not come back. There were mornings when breakfast ended in sudden tears, triggered by something as simple as a missing spoon or a crumpled drawing. But there was also laughter, unexpected, loud, and contagious. It snuck in between the sadness and slowly began to take up space. Andrew found himself changing more than he thought possible. At work, he started arriving later and leaving earlier. His once flawless punctuality had been replaced with school drop-offs, PTA meetings, and last-minute bake sale contributions he usually forgot until the night before. His assistants learned to block out certain hours labeled only as "dad time," and no one dared question it. For the first time, Andrew's life wasn't built entirely around profit margins and quarterly forecasts. It was built around routines that made no sense on a balance sheet but felt more important than anything else: morning cuddles, bath time songs, packing lunch boxes with silly notes tucked inside. It didn't take long before the girls began carving out their own identities in his world, in ways that surprised and delighted him. Mia, always the artist, started leaving drawings everywhere. Some were taped to the office walls, others slipped into folders that executives opened mid-meeting to find stick figures of people holding hands or giant suns with smiling faces. One of her crayon masterpieces, a portrait of Andrew holding all three girls with the caption, "My dad is the best boss," ended up in a corporate newsletter when someone scanned it by accident. It went viral within days. Instead of being embarrassed, Andrew asked the design team to frame it. It now hung behind his desk. Hazel, more inquisitive and bold, took a liking to technology. One weekend, she asked to borrow his old tablet and, by Monday, had created a mock website called Hazel Tech, complete with a logo and a blog post titled "Things Adults Should Learn from Kids." Her list included items like, "Don't yell when you're hungry, take more naps," and "Say sorry even if you don't mean it at first." Amused, Andrew helped her turn it into a small project. With the help of his IT department, they built a real version of Hazel's site. Within weeks, other kids started submitting their own advice, and soon they were getting emails from teachers asking if they could use the content in classrooms. Lily, the quietest of the three, bloomed in her own unexpected way. She had a softness to her, a gentleness that made people lean in when she spoke. One morning, after watching a video about a charity helping children without homes, she asked Andrew if they could do something to help. Not wanting to brush her off, he told her she could come up with a plan and they'd talk about it. The next day, she presented a hand-drawn flyer titled "Lily's Little Hearts Project." She wanted to send care boxes with books, stuffed animals, and notes to children in hospitals or shelters. Andrew took it seriously. He brought it to the company's philanthropy board, and soon Brightcore launched a new initiative in Lily's name. She gave her first speech, standing on a crate in front of employees in the company atrium, her voice shaking at first but growing stronger with every word. She ended with, "We don't have to be big to be kind. We just have to start." The girls weren't just adapting to life with Andrew, they were reshaping it. And through them, the company began to shift too. Policies became more family-friendly. Mental health days were introduced. Office events included "Bring Your Kid to Work" months instead of days. Employees started bringing drawings and handmade gifts to decorate their desks. The culture of Brightcore, once sharp and relentless, softened without losing its edge. Investors noticed the shift in energy and called it innovative. Analysts praised Andrew for modern emotional leadership. But Andrew didn't care about the headlines. He cared about the mornings when Mia asked if he could walk her to school holding her hand. He cared about the night Hazel told him she liked it better when he messed up the bedtime story voices because it sounds funnier when you try too hard. He cared about the way Lily started humming again when she was drawing, something Sophie had told him she used to do before the sickness made her quiet. There was a moment one Saturday afternoon, as they all lay on a picnic blanket in Central Park, when Andrew looked up at the sky and realized something he hadn't been able to put into words until then. He wasn't just surviving fatherhood. He was growing into it. And the girls, in all their chaos and brilliance, weren't just fitting into his world, they had rebuilt it from the inside out. They hadn't saved him from his loneliness, they had replaced it entirely with something louder, messier, and infinitely more alive. It was nearly a year to the day since the girls had first walked into his office, clutching their yellow backpacks and hand-drawn resumes, and in that time, Andrew Blake's life had changed so completely that the man he used to be felt like a distant echo. The penthouse no longer echoed with silence but with music, footsteps, and the endless chatter of three voices always asking, always imagining, always needing. His home had transformed into a place of life, not curated perfection, but real, vivid, sometimes messy life. Crayon marks on the walls, laundry that never seemed to end, and stray glitter still clinging to the edges of his briefcase were part of the daily rhythm now. And he wouldn't have traded any of it. On the anniversary of Sophie's passing, Andrew didn't go to the office. He made pancakes instead, Sophie's recipe, slightly burned at the edges the way the girls liked them. They spent the morning in pajamas, watching old videos of Sophie reading bedtime stories or singing lullabies. The girls cried a little, then laughed when Sophie did that silly voice she used to use for fairy tale villains. It hurt, but it was gentle hurt now, wrapped in memory and love, not in sharp loss. Healing had come slowly, not in one moment, but in thousands of small ones. Later that afternoon, while organizing a drawer in his study, Andrew came across the resumes the girls had first given him that day in his office. He sat down on the edge of the bed and unfolded each sheet, his eyes lingering on the crooked handwriting, the hearts in the margins, the way Lily had spelled experience as experience. He read every line as if for the first time, and something inside him ached, in that good, unbearable way that only comes from knowing just how much you've gained after almost losing everything. One page in particular caught his attention. Mia's resume. Under, "Why do you want to work here?" she had written in big, uneven letters, "So we can be with Daddy." That single line undid him more than any headline, any award, any stock market high ever could. He didn't cry often, but he did then. Not from sadness. From awe. From the impossible wonder of how these three little girls had walked into his office demanding a job and somehow filled the vacancy in his heart he hadn't even known was there. He had the pages framed the next day. Now, when people entered his office, visitors, investors, new employees, they all noticed the three simple frames hanging above the couch, next to sleek modern art and accolades from Fortune and Forbes. Some smiled. Some asked about them. Andrew always answered with the same quiet pride, "Those are my most important hires." Word about his transformation had spread beyond the company. Articles called him the human CEO, the man who had brought heart back into corporate leadership. Podcasts invited him to speak, profiles were written, and his once stone-faced reputation was now layered with warmth and presence. None of it mattered to him as much as the look in the girls' eyes when they ran into his arms at the end of each school day. He had traded polished solitude for a wild, unpredictable kind of love that didn't care about meetings or schedules. He had learned how to tie ballet shoes, how to wash crayon off suede, how to argue with 6-year-olds about bedtime and still be outnumbered 3-1. He had learned how to parent not from books, but from listening, to their fears, their joy, their nonsense, and their wisdom. Each of the girls had changed too. Mia had started entering art contests and recently had one of her pieces displayed in a children's gallery. Hazel had begun building her own computer game with help from bright core developers, and her blog was now read by kids and teachers across the country. Lily had expanded her Care Box project to include birthday letters to children who had no one else to celebrate with. They weren't just thriving, they were creating worlds from their pain, building joy out of what they'd lost. And Andrew, standing in the middle of it all, often marveled at how resilient love could be when given the space to grow. One night, as he was tucking them into bed, Hazel asked him the question he hadn't expected. "Are we really your daughters now? Not just kinda." He looked at her, then at Mia and Lily, both waiting quietly for the answer. He reached into the drawer of the bedside table and pulled out 3 small boxes, each wrapped in soft gold paper. The girls opened them to find delicate bracelets, custom-made. Each one had a charm, a tiny heart, a star, and a key. On the inside of the bands, engraved in tiny script, was the same phrase on all 3, chosen. Loved. Forever. You're not kinda anything, he said, his voice steady. You're mine. In every way that matters. And nothing, not ever, will change that. The girls tackled him with hugs, their tiny arms wrapping around his neck, and in that moment, with their laughter filling the room and their hearts wrapped around his, Andrew knew the truth he hadn't dared to believe before. He hadn't just been given a second chance at family, he had built one. Not by accident. Not by obligation. But by choice. And that choice, every single day, was the best one he had ever made. This story, at its core, is about rediscovery, of love, of identity, and of purpose. What begins as a shocking revelation transforms into something much deeper than just a man meeting his daughters. It's a journey from isolation to intimacy, from control to connection. Andrew doesn't simply accept fatherhood, he is broken open by it, reshaped by the chaos and vulnerability it demands. What I find most powerful is that the girls aren't just background characters or passive children waiting to be saved, they're the emotional architects of Andrew's transformation. They pull him out of the glass tower of his curated life and teach him how to live without armor. And that's what makes the ending so satisfying. It's not perfect, not tied up with unrealistic simplicity. But it's real, earned, and deeply human. This isn't a fairy tale where love arrives fully formed. It's a love story built brick by brick through bedtime stories, kitchen disasters, grief, and small moments of courage. And in the end, that's the kind of happy ending that feels not only possible, but profoundly deserved.